In our last video, I told you that we would be talking about the St. Clair Tunnel story today. Where should we begin? Well, I guess a good place is the beginning. It was the late 1800s. Benjamin Harrison was president. Port Huron was a growing city. People were talking about this thing called electricity that you could just turn a switch on in your house and maybe they would have it soon. There was already a new electric company formed called the Excelsior Electric Company, and they've already got street lights, arc lighting on the major intersections of town, 20 of them. And there was at least 14 merchants that had electricity in their stores. Others were talking about this new mode of transportation called a horseless carriage. No one had ever seen one yet, but they were hoping they would. But there was one mode of transportation that was already there that was making the country smaller. And that was the railroads. Folks actually had a chance to see relatives, not having to spend 3 weeks getting there. And of course the manufacturers loved it because they could get their goods to their customers much faster. As a boy growing up in Port Huron, I was very familiar with the Grand Trunk Railroad. Matter of fact, I thought it was our own personal railroad, the Port Huron Railroad, or at the very least a Michigan Railroad. And much to my surprise, as many of you know, I found out that it was actually a Canadian railroad. Thus, the maple leaf behind the logo. By 1859, Grand Trunk owned an 800-mile network that stretched from key ports in the east, Montreal, Quebec, and Portland, Maine, to Sarnia. By the time that railroad reached the east bank of the St. Clair River, it was recognized that Chicago would be a key center in a very fertile Midwest. Products from the Midwest would flow through Chicago on their way to the East Coast or Europe, and settlers would pass through Chicago on their way west. The Grand Trunk Railway of Canada had the advantage of serving ocean ports that were much closer to Europe than New York or Boston. March of 1858, officials associated with the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada incorporated the Chicago, Detroit, and Canada Grand Trunk Junction Railroad Company. Boy, that's a mouthful, isn't it? And they were to build a line 60 miles from Fort Gratiot to Detroit. The line was completed in November of 1859. And almost immediately, the Grand Trunk Railroad reached an agreement with the Michigan Central Railroad to transport freight and passengers from Detroit to Chicago. That meant that goods and travelers could go directly from Chicago to Montreal or Portland and then on to Europe. This Port Huron to Detroit line is the railroad where Thomas Edison first worked as a news butcher when he was 14 years old. So everything's fine now, right? No, this fellow right here is going to cause some problems for Grand Trunk. His name is Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he was the owner of the New York Central Railroad, among others. By the early 1870s, it became clear to the owners of Grand Trunk Railway that Vanderbilt and his associates were seeking to dominate the railroads that linked the East Coast to Chicago. The Vanderbilt sought to purchase Michigan Central with its direct line from Chicago to Detroit, and then another line that stretched across southern Ontario from Detroit to Buffalo. Controlling those railroads would give Vanderbilt a convenient line from the East Coast to Chicago. Owners of the Grand Trunk feared after the Vanderbilts took control of Michigan Central, that line would either refuse to carry their freight and passengers across Michigan to Chicago, or impose impossibly high charges. Fearing financial strangulation from the Vanderbilt Michigan Central, the Grand Trunk sought to establish their own line from Port Huron to Chicago. And that's a long story, but they finally did it. Now only one obstacle remained, the beautiful St. Clair River. This was a major challenge for the Grand Trunk Railway. Everything and everybody had to be unloaded in Sarnia or Port Huron. They moved the goods across the water on a side-wheel steamer at the W.J. Spicer, and then they reloaded the freight onto railroad cars on the other side. Of course, this created quite a bottleneck. The meat packers of Chicago weren't pleased at all. The Swift Company had begun the practice of shipping dressed meats kept fresh in insulated cars with ice that the railroad had to replenish along the way. Grand Trunk became a leader in providing special services to Swift and other packers and carried 138,000 tons of dressed meat in 1885 alone. It But the Grand Trunk dressed meat became its third most important freight by the mid-1880s, exceeded only by wheat and livestock. The refrigerated cars were quite primitive by today's standards. Basically, it was just hunks of ice stuck at each end of the railroad car. And while these cars were waiting at the bottleneck of the St. Clair River, the ice was melting. And if the Grand Trunk employees weren't on the ball, you could have some lost meat. They couldn't even consider bringing rail cars across the river yet because of the difference in the tracks between the Canadian and the Americans. The Canadian tracks were about 10 inches wider than the American tracks. It wasn't until 1873 when the Grand Trunk adopted the same gauge as those of their southern neighbor, and that allowed for the very first time for rail cars to be taken across the St. Clair River. The Grand Trunk engine pulled into the Grand Trunk Freight Yard in Port Huron. They were pulling into this area right here, which is basically now condos and a hotel. But back then, it was a pretty busy freight yard. We don't have a good picture of it, but we do have the diagram of how it was laid out. As we zoom in here, you can see State Street at the top of the map, and that's about where the Blue Water Bridge is today. And then as we go down a little bit to the right, of course, you see the roundhouse, and then below that you can see the different sidings and switches. Grand Trunk car shops were a little bit north of the roundhouse, just the other side of where the bridge would be today. This picture here that was taken much later, after the bridge was built actually, but you can still see some of the freight yard, but not like it was originally. So finally a car ferry was introduced that eliminated the need to unload and reload cargo, as the new ferry could transport the railway cars themselves across the river. But the ferry was unlike all others. It was a swing ferry, and we looked at this in a previous video, so we won't spend a lot of time. There was a 1,000-foot chain that the swing ferry was attached to, and they were anchored in Fort Gratiot and Point Edward. And of course this took the ferry across using the current to its advantage. And you can see here the ferry arrived in Point Edward at the southern part of the Grand Trunk rail yard in Point Edward. Point Edward rail yard was almost directly opposite the Fort Gratiot rail yard. And you can see it here. You can see the train station is that larger building closer to the water. We'll zoom in a little bit here. In 1872, the Grand Trunk prepared to retire the swing ferry, enlarge the slips at Point Edward and Fort Gratiot, and put in service a self-propelled car ferry, the International. She was constructed and deconstructed in Great Britain and shipped like a model kit to be reassembled in Port Huron. It could transport up to 400 cars per day across the river. In 1875, the Grand Trunk added a second ferry, the Huron, with a capacity of 24 cars. As the volume of traffic crossing the St. Clair River rose dramatically in the 1880s, the logistic problems became staggering. In 1888, the Grand Trunk moved roughly 297,000 freight cars, 28,000 passenger cars, and 9,000 baggage and mail cars across the St. Clair River. That's roughly 1,000 cars per day. To carry this volume, both car ferries operated around the clock and had to complete one crossing per hour. According to one estimate, by the mid-1880s, the Grand Trunk carried 1/3 of all the freight between the Midwest and New England. This gives you a great look at a car ferry. You can see there's 3 separate tracks going on the car ferry. One goes right down the middle between the supports, and the other 2 curve around the supports. And then up on top, you got a pretty good view from the pilot house. Grand Trunk built larger and more powerful and faster ferries. Indeed, there was one design that would take no more than 8 minutes to cross the quickly flowing St. Clair River. But no matter what kind of ferry they had, in the wintertime, when the ice broke up in Lake Huron and came down and jammed up the river, not only was there a bottleneck, but sometimes it was impossible to cross. So even though the crossing was much faster, it was still a bottleneck at the international border. The steam ferries carried trains across the river until Sir Henry W. Tyler, president of the Grand Trunk Railway, decided that a tunnel was the solution to the unattainable traffic jam. In October of 1884, the Grand Trunk chartered the St. Clair Frontier Tunnel Company as a Canadian corporation to construct the tunnel, and Tyler put Canadian engineer Joseph Hobson in charge of the project. The Grand Trunk also chartered the Port Huron Railroad Tunnel Company in Michigan in October of 1886, and in November of 1886 the railroad merged the twin companies to form the St. Clair Tunnel Company. Join me in our next video and see the first completed tunnel to be built in North America underneath water, the St. Clair Tunnel. You'll see the creative people that designed it, and you'll see the innovative workers that built it. So join me.